But once again, Rajul, thanks a lot for making time for us. We've obviously done a fair bit to try and let people know who you are, and I think people are already well aware. But just for completeness, would love for the quick, 2-minute intro on your background, the businesses you built, what you're doing today at Leo Capital, and then we'll dive right into the more subject matter areas of what we wanted to discuss.
Again, thank you for inviting me, and good to meet everyone on the call. Um, so, so my name is Rajul, and I graduated in 1998 from IIT Delhi, and then I became an entrepreneur right away. So I'm an entrepreneur turned VC. The first company I started is Pine Labs, which is a leading payment company. You swipe your card, you'll probably have heard of it. I'm not no more involved in the company. I sold a long time back, probably too early. But I did build the software, so very proud to sort of see it go all the way. Then I started a company called Global Logic, and I think this topic particularly is of interest to me also because when I was in Global Logic, I was one of four co-founders, and my title was Chief Operating Officer, COO. So for 6 years, I sort of held intense operational role, grew the team. Life was all about operations completely. I think I did sort of a mini PhD on ops. This is in early 2000s. And then Global Logic got sold as well, eventually to Apex, large private equity player. Gradually turned investor. First, I started investing my own money as an individual. Did that for a few years, got into some interesting companies like Misho, 1MG, bunch of others. And then basically started Leo Capital, where we make early stage tech investments in startups for the last 8 years. I think in between, I also did an ed tech venture called Sunstone, which is kind of now being run by a different team as still a small show, also a very operational business, in terms of student experience and this and that. So I think all I would say is that sort of a lot of operations and sort of VC experience with operations is very close to my heart. I think that is the source of strategic advantage for most companies eventually, because all the other fancy stuff kind of dies down gradually and people catch up. But it's the guts of the business, how you turn the wheels day in day out, which matter and ultimately make the difference. So it's a topic which is close to me.
No, I'm very glad, Rajul, that you agree with all of us that ops does indeed matter. And maybe with that, we jump right into sort of like understanding how these things happened in the past, right? So for this session, I think we'll do it in three parts. For one is to understand, some of these more traditionally ops heavy industries that you've either built, you worked in, you serviced as a technology provider at Global Logic, at Mind Labs. How have these evolved over time? Second, to try and understand in this day and age how you're seeing AI transform these kind of businesses. And then also some context for folks who are trying to build their own software and product companies, either in the audience immediately today or folks in the community and otherwise who will view this later. What advice you might have for, not just how to build a business that is leveraging AI, but to also leverage AI in your own business itself, right? To improve your operations, your productivity, and so on and so forth. So maybe starting off with the first one, it'd be awesome to get a little bit of perspective. You mentioned that there was a lot of operational intensity in the work that you were doing as you were building both of these companies. What did operations at Pine Labs, at Global Logic, at similar players, back in the 2000s, what did that look like? What did ops mean? And in the context of the business you've built, what does operations excellence broadly look like? I think that'd be a fantastic grounding for us to move ahead with the session.
Yeah, yeah. So look, maybe let me start with Global Logic, and then I'll talk about Pine Labs as well. So Global Logic was and is a more traditional services company. So it's a simple business, like you can say Infosys or Wipro. You find customers. The specific positioning of a Global Logic was to service product companies. So our customers were companies like Microsoft, Google, Telcordia, sort of large technology companies who were looking to operationalize their R&D globally versus, let's say, a Wipro or Infosys or TCS, which in the day were servicing more the CIO function, like things like SAP implementation, Oracle implementation, tools. They were part of the CIO budget and we were part of the CTO budget in that sense, right? But from our perspective, from a day-to-day perspective, what it meant was putting teams together, delivering engineering results, and basically getting paid. So we would sort of submit a timesheet ultimately, right? We were charging per hour, per day, and the industry largely has continued to work in the same way, where people produce a timesheet, which is the key deliverable, at the end of the month, and you invoice on that basis. So I think it was really literally back in Global Logic in the day, and I'll come also forward to how it's kind of changing, but it was really all ops because I think if you think about the business, it's really when you're selling thin air. In some sense, you go to a customer and say, we'll become a part of your R&D team, we'll help build your products. And then it's all about sort of staffing those projects, right from staffing, which is, finding the right people, so there's a whole team of recruiters, and so there's one portion of ops, right, which is kind of finding those people from the open market, getting through the interview process. So, making sure that so operational excellence would look like interviewing enough candidates, making sure that, you're doing it the right way, you're sending out the offers, following up on the offers, getting them onboarded, then sort of getting them retained in the company, and then all those people being put to work in the right opportunities. Imagine that at a 10,000 people scale or 100,000 people scale, right? And then basically making sure that people are actually coming to office, working, making sure sort of, their buses are going on time to pick them up, the food shows up, which never happened, basically, that people are happy with food, and things like that. So I think, and then I think on the customer end, producing obviously, work proofs, customer management, which is kind of measured by the customer satisfaction score, making sure the employees are happy, which is measured by the employee satisfaction score, and then basically the financial metrics of it, that you're making enough money by the end of it. So there's enough gross margin, there's low churn, and then you're growing all that. So, right. So there's like a big, massive operations. There's like, that's all there is. I mean, that's 80% of the business. It's basically 20% sales and then 80% is business, you know. Sorry, you're saying something.
No, I was just also asking how many folks worked at Global Logic at that point of time, right? How many buses, how many lunches, and lunchtime disappointments were y'all handling
A
at that
lot.
point?
It felt like a lot. The disappointments felt like a lot. But I think I think when I sort of ceased being a CEO, we were about 1,000 people. So I became the CEO sort of in 2001, 2002, and then I hired a CEO in 2006, and then I moved to M&A. So for like 5, 6 years, it was directly responsible to me, and I think about 1,000 grew to 1,000 people. So
Got it.
that was a lot. Like, I mean, I like even simple things like if I would come to my office, on my average day, I would have like 12, 13, 14 meetings, half an hour time slot. My calendar was like packed, right? And I think right from then your customers meeting in the evening, and typically one meeting would stop, the next would be standing outside kind of thing. So like intense operational role for many
No,
years.
completely
Yeah.
understand. And if you switch gears to, say, a company that's like Pine Labs, right? Which obviously you spent a lot of time there in a
Yeah.
more software technology role. But at the
Yeah.
end of the day, going out, deploying POSes, convincing shopkeepers that this is a payment mode that you need to take, right?
Yeah.
All of us were probably back in like school at that point of time. I mean, not all of us, but most of us were probably back in school. We're more familiar with the QR code deployment era of the UPI sort of like proliferation, right? But back in the day, when you were deploying these POSes for the first time and card payments weren't really even a thing in India, could you tell us a little bit about what operations look like at that
Yeah.
point of time as well?
Certainly. So, if you take a step back and look at the larger payment ecosystem, then whether you have a QR code or whether you swipe your card on a point of sales terminal, the larger ecosystem is still the same, which means that, somebody is a pair, it's called an issuer, somebody is an acquirer, the merchant, things like that. And then there is a bank involved usually, there's reconciliation and things like that. So actually the overall ops in the ecosystem are massive. If you think of, let's start with, acquirer ops, the sales ops, as it's called, let's say, right? So now you have all these merchants, right? And in our day, terminals needed to be deployed at these merchants. So physically, there was a company, maybe they're still in business, they're called High Tech at the time. And this is all they did. They basically had a field force of literally thousands of people who would go and physically put these terminals out there, train merchants how to use them. And in those days, they used to run on telephone lines to make sure that the telephones line work, right? And basically, transaction is going through. and sort of, merchant is happy and things like that. That has turned into QR code today, but I'm sure still there is an element of merch. Somebody's still going there, pasting the QR code. This competitor, somebody pastes something else on top of your QR code. So you want to go back and make sure, it's still there. You still need to make sure that the merchant is using it, knows how to use it. Obviously, some things have become easier. You don't have to worry about phone line, but I'm sure it's still. And now, for example, you have the sound boxes, which is again sort of the hardware. So again, I'm sure people are going in, deploying it, maintaining it, and things like that. So it's actually, if you look at the merchant side of the operations, it's become better mainly because the phone line not being there, because that was a whole problem in its own. But it has also expanded manyfold. So that's one whole merchant side of operations. Then you have the whole, user side of operations. Again, sort of at that time, we were doing these chip cards or magnetic swipe cards and things like that. So again, there's a whole ops involved in making sure that card reaches that person, they're able to use it, it always works, and all that stuff, which today has been changed to a mobile phone. Many people are using mobile apps, for these kind of products. But again, there is a operational component of, let's say, sending them statements. Then there is a whole operational component of managing loyalty programs, which continues to be a big part of this whole thing, right? So basically, how many points you get, when you commit points, what happens to those points, those rupees, if there's a cashback, that cashback is actually getting through, things like that. So that's another sort of huge operational component. And then basically there's the whole compliance and the bank side, which people don't even see. There's the massive reconciliation. Just imagine, right? Like at a scale, there's so much happening, right? So there's usually in this industry an end of day process, which is run every day, which is kind of produces these all kinds of reports. In our time, this used to be like printouts, that used to come out. And I remember sort of literally people used to look at them, every day and say, okay, yeah, the totals match here. At least the card side total matches to the merchant side total. And if it doesn't match, it's like a nightmare. Then you go through literally, why it doesn't match. And, you have to reconcile because it's an audit issue. These are
Yep,
financial
yep.
systems, stuff like that. So the operational component in these ecosystems is significant, not depending on where you play. If you're a pure technology provider, you might do just that bit of it, right? But in the ecosystem, there's massive ops, that kind of keeps it up and running.
And I think, you talking about how back in the day you were dealing with phone lines and then with physical printouts, and then recon was a line by line matching, and if it didn't, it's a nightmare. And it's a great segue to sort of understand, as you build the companies and then you were able to observe them from afar even after, right? How have you seen, like, software-led automation transforming these industries over time, right? I mean, we've all heard of, like, the first set of sort of like RPA projects that people launched to try and do certain things. Then you had your cloud-based SaaS solutions that came up in the 2010s, and today you have AI. But before we get to what's happening today, I think a little bit of history on how you've seen financial services, how you've seen the kind of work that companies like Global Logic itself does in terms of the solutions that they deploy for their software company partners and the broader IT services landscape. Would just love to understand, some of these sectors. How have you seen the movement from like pen and paper and very human-led operations to something that's been significantly automated or augmented using software? A little bit of that background, a little bit of that history from your perspective would be amazing.
Certainly. So maybe I'll just take a little detour into sort of software history, and then maybe just then come back and apply
Awesome.
it to
Yes,
some of
please.
these specific examples. So look, I think if you go back, then, I think the first kind of major level of automation was from paper to computer, right? Which, let's say, happened in the 80s, became more mainstream in the 80s. Before that, everything was paper. Thankfully, I was never a part of that world. So I think, I didn't get to see that, but I know I have dealt with people who are part of that. So that was a significant productivity improvement, as you can imagine, right? Because paper needs to be stored, it's not searchable, it takes us so much slower to write and all that, right? So that's a significant productivity improvement. Like a person, probably gained 70, 80% productive, like five people's job could be done by one person, just because you were able to change things from paper to computer and things like that. Then I think after that, what I would say is that, internet came in the 90s, and there was a lot of, I would say, always on type of behavior that started coming in because of cloud and internet. So earlier, you always had to, the accessibility to systems was not there, which became increasingly so with cloud. You could access them anywhere. Then mobile came, smartphones came in sort of late 2000s, and, in the last 15 years. So basically, all the systems basically became always on. You can access them anywhere, all kinds of things you can do. So, so that just reduced the processing time. Like if I have a dependency on you, usually if earlier that dependency had to wait for a day, today it just waits for an hour maybe, right? I mean, wherever you are, generally you would approve it, you would do your job, right? I think with AI now, I think it's the estimates of productivity that at least what I'm seeing are same as what happened when we moved from paper to computer. So basically, in my sort of working lifetime, I have never seen this kind of productivity gain because a lot of automation that we saw in the last 25 years pre-AI was this always on type of behavior, more reliable, more features, process, even automate the small processes, more collaboration, things like that. But like if I think of like, how many sort of human hours are required to get a process done, they were continual but marginal improvements in that, 10%, 10%, 5%, right? Now with AI, obviously, I think we are seeing 80%, 90% gains. And so again, we're back to that situation where a 5 person's job can be done by 1 person, which is akin to when we last saw from paper to computer move. So in my sort of last 20 years, until pre-AI, I think when I look at companies like Pine Labs, Global Logic, I don't see a significant change. Like when I look at sort of how the payment ecosystem works today versus how it used to work in 2000, 2001, sure, instead of like the paper printouts, people are getting emails, there's a lot more automation already. So there's a machine learning sort of, that matches those total and throws up, the exceptions on their own. But also what has happened is that the business has increased significantly as well. So what has happened is that, there are more and more people involved in the whole process. And there is kind of automation access everywhere. But I wouldn't say that the business has fundamentally changed in any way. It's still the same. Like I said, the QR code, instead of point of sale, you have QR code, you have soundbox, right? But the fundamental way the payment system works is exactly the same, in my view. Also, it's very tightly governed by regulator, RBI. So there's only so much you can do, in terms of innovation and things like that. I think in the Global Logic example, I would say again, they have mostly been beneficiaries of more technology coming in over the last 20 years. So let's say, for example, more cloud came in, they started implementing cloud-based products. So there was a whole sort of shift to, writing more code to make, but then mobile came in, they sort of latched on to that, right? And I think and like that, after since Y2K, so it was kind of internet, Y2K, cloud, mobile, those have all been good stories for the IT outsourcing market, and they've been sort of building those products, enabling more and more access. I think outsourcing particularly seems to be now coming upon some sort of an existential crisis. I think it has been talked about, for a decade at least. I think people have been expecting it to come in, but I think we already see large companies reducing their hiring, TCs of the word, things like that, because this is truly sort of the time when it feels like 10 people's job can be done by 1 person or 2 people. And this industry is largely still predicated on headcount based billing, per person per hour, and it's not easy to change that. So I would say there's a lot happening in this industry right now. Like for example, there are new companies which are coming up, which are AI native services, which are sort of passing on these efficiencies to their customers, because for incumbents it's very hard to capture this value and destroy their own businesses. So I think so. There's a lot happening in this industry, I would say, particularly now.
Got it.
Given everything.
Understood. We have a quick question from the audience, and it's an interesting one. In the days where Wipro, Infosys, TCS, and the like were already present, right, and outsourcing of technology services was already a mainstream thing by that time to an extent. What specific gap did you see in the market that led you and your co-founders to build Global Logic? A question from Pranjal in the audience. Thank you for that question, Pranjal.
Yeah, Pranjal, so the specific segment of the industry that we got into has now come to known as OPD, outsourced product development. So there are subtle differences when you sell to a CIO versus when you sell to a CTO. When you sell to a CIO, think of it, let's say if you're selling to a Wells Fargo bank CIO, then CIO has a certain percentage of the budget, right? Normally, basically, 4% of the company's turnover is CIO's budget. And within that, they're required to do certain things, maintain their SAP implementation, Oracle implementation, Salesforce, right? All the tools that they have, implement some new tools. And Infosys, Wipro were largely Y2K, then cloud migration, right? These are the kind of things that they do. And Infosys, Wipros of the world did an excellent job of sort of, putting into them competencies and building competencies and structuring their contracts. But I think when we said, we went to, let's say, like a Google and said, we will help you build your products globally. So like, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Google Apps you're building in the US today. We'll help you build them in India, Ukraine. We had a larger opportunity to Ukraine, maybe China, and to help you build more global products. And we'll also help you take them to market later. When you sort of ultimately, if you break it down, comes down to engineers, but the way you work is very different. Because the goals are very different. The goals are much more faster time to market, more product per engineer. So the metrics change versus when you're looking at the CIO. So I think that helped us succeed and sort of build out a business around that.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for that. And maybe just one last question before we move in, to discuss today and what's happening more clearly with AI. Like my last question, any examples of, some of these initiatives that you saw either at Pine Labs, at Global Logic, where things changed a lot because of software, right? Like you moved from the traditional sort of like era to something that was more cloud-based, right? You implemented some of these automations in how you were developing software, or managing customers from a payments perspective. So we'd love to know if you have any that are top of mind, and then we'll get right into trying and understanding what value and opportunity you're seeing with AI, especially from an investor lens as well.
Look, if you look at software against sort of pre-AI, year on year, I would say it was a continuous incremental improvement, like 10, 15% every year, let's say something like that. But when you take it and accumulate and you compare after 15, 20 years, these are transformational literally in every case. So you look at for example, literally any customer, you look at payment and look at, let's say, how much the payment ecosystem has grown. So like our like if you look at the credit card themselves, so our customers were like ICICI Bank, HDFC Bank at the time, who were launching these credit card machines and things like that. And the numbers in those times used to be 10,000, 20,000 terminals deployed. Now we have like literally millions of these terminals, which are deployed. And the number of features that they have, like it was just at that, I mean, if you go further back, then the way payment processing was done was that they used to take an imprint of your card. I don't know if any of you have seen this, called a kitch catch machine. You took a carbon copy of the credit card, and then they used to call the bank and say that, can I take an approval for this much? And they would write down the approval code on a physical paper. So I think so it's come a long way. You have like all these EMI, you have all these like loan products, which are right on the terminal. You have all these loyalty products. So each of them on their own look small, but when you compare to, let's say, terminal in 2001 to, let's say, 2025, it's a completely different beast. It does like advanced analytics. It's become a revenue driver for the merchant. It's become a revenue driver for the bank. It's become a lending product. It's become a marketing product. So there's just a sea change in what all it does today versus it used to do 20 years back.
Got it. Awesome. No, I think that's the perfect segue into the second part of our conversation, which is understanding how AI can drive significant transformation, right? So maybe I ask you a more open-ended question to begin with, right? Which is,
Yeah.
what are you most excited about in terms of the potential that AI has for transformation? If you were to maybe think about two, three, four of the more traditional industries where you're seeing a lot of transformation happen, where you're closely tracking companies and working with founders, what is that thesis for where building an AI makes sense? What are some of the biggest opportunities that you see from a AI-led transformation perspective? And I'm a big fan of this. I continuously try to look, even in my current role today, these traditional industries, whether it's manufacturing, logistics, shipping, airlines, and of course healthcare and financial services. What are the different ways in which you can potentially deploy? But would love to know, especially from your global perspective, given that Leo's operating across geographies over the last several years, how you're seeing this play out.
Sure. So, firstly, firstly, I would say that I'm really excited about AI, and I think not everybody is. I see also some skeptics, and they're like, okay, what will happen? In my view, most people many people are underestimating what the impact is and what all it can do, because they may or may not have seen real implementations and sort of how fast it's evolving and how much it can do. So I think the first thing I would say is that it's very much here. And like I said earlier, I have not seen this kind of transformation in my working sort of years, or last 25 years or so. It's actually really next level sci-fi type stuff. I think to give you some examples, maybe I can just take some examples from our portfolio companies because we're just very close to them. I think one of our portfolio companies works in logistics space in the US. It's called lanesurf.com. You can check out their sort of website, and they have actually a demo on their website of their voice agentic call, which you should listen to. I think you'll get a sense of what I'm talking. So what they do is that, in the US, you have all these truck drivers, right? And all these truck drivers are looking for load. They want demand, right? To carry, let's say they want to carry tomatoes from San Francisco to sort of LA, and get paid for them. So to get the load, they call what they call a broker, and the broker has demand linkages. Broker has a tie-up at the back, with tomato companies, shippers, things like that, right? So when they call the broker says, okay, this is the load that you need to carry, from X to Y. This is the price. Do we have a deal? And the truck driver says, yeah, some negotiation, da da da, and sort of a deal gets done, right? This is how the sort of a big part of the logistic industry works in the US. So our company lanesurf.com has basically made an AI agent for this particular broker. And what you'll see on their website is a recording of a live call, between the agent and the truck driver, and it's been just completely transformational. So I think some of us might remember calls from the past, like bot calls, press one for this, press two for this, press three for this. It sounded very robotic and this and that. But when you look at some of these calls, you just can't tell. The truck driver can't really tell. And on top of that, what is happening is that a lot of these truck drivers are from different nationalities, like many times from Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the human agents always struggle to understand their accents. Where in this case there is absolutely no issue. You don't have to repeat yourself even once. And finally, what they're seeing is that because there's a rate negotiation involved a little bit, when you're doing this, the AI agents are doing a better job of negotiating rates than human people. So they're delivering like 10 to 12% better rates, versus human people. Now, this is an industry which employs 800,000 people, which do this. Most of them are in the US, some of them are also in India. So it's kind of imminent that it's better, faster, cheaper, lower overhead, more scalable, so it's impossible for me to imagine how this industry will not be fully disrupted, using AI. The process is just begin. We have one company, there are multiple companies in this space who are coming at it, in different ways, but feels imminent to me that this will sort of this industry will look extremely different, in a few years. And similar examples we have across, in financial services, healthcare, legal fraternity, payroll management, recruiting. You take, let's say, any sphere of life. I mean, think of this way, that where you have, more human interaction, right? Which is big part of the business, right? Where, whether it's recruiting or even simple HR, think of it like many companies have. We used to have like this birthday thing, right? That every time there's employee's birthday, if there's a person who would make sure that they wish them happy birthday and all that, right? When you're at scale. So wherever you have these kind of things, there is just almost an inevitable sort of walk of AI on top of that, and it's becoming more and more powerful to be able to do more and more. So this is, but I mean, I could give you many examples. That's one top of my mind, right now.
And if you had to sort of tell us, what has been the broad thesis? Like when you look at a company that's building, say you gave the example here of LaneServe building in logistics. I'm sure there's others in your portfolio, or just themes and companies that you've been tracking and excited by. How do you think about the thesis in terms of what products should people build, right? What's the right angle of attack? So clearly here there was an angle of attack in terms of, okay, there's a lot of calling that the broker has to do. It's a people intensive job. As you said, there are also complexities in terms of language, understanding, accents. And then of course that it's not just an information call. It's also a commercial call because there's a financial negotiation that's involved and that directly impacts the top and bottom line. Right. So this was a very interesting way to think about, okay, this is an area of transformation that AI can clearly deliver. Right. In a broader and more general sense, how do you think about this? The folks who are trying to build products using AI and like deploying AI native software in different industries, how should they think about this angle of attack? What are some of the different ways in which they can scope out the opportunities and therefore then decide, okay, this is the product that I need to build?
So it's truly a world of opportunities right now. I think in spite of all the, hoo about AI and in the last couple of years, I think true AI adoption has only begun to happen. So I think there is a whole sort of next 5 to 10 years of extensive AI adoption, ahead of us. Just to give you a parallel, we think of cloud sort of as something which has been there for a long time. Cloud started in 1999, cloud.com, as a term. Ben Horowitz sort of made that. And we're 26 years into it. So today we're about 60, 70% cloud adoption, right? So it takes a long time for things to get adopted. And even though it's accelerating, but it still takes a while. It's not going to happen in like 2 years, 3 years, even 5 years. It's going to be easily 10, 15 years of adoption cycle to get to the same level, especially when you talk about enterprises and things like that. Now, to come to a specific question, look, you can think of it this way that there are these horizontal platforms, which are obviously they start with the foundational models, LLMs of the word. Uh, and then there are other horizontal things one can build as well. So horizontal things would be like cursors of the words, is a coding platform, vibe coding, it came out of nowhere. Or you could build, testing around, like one of our companies, Lambda Test, has a product called KNAI, which is testing sort of auto-generated code, things like that. You can have cybersecurity, which is another sort of major topic, which is completely changing in the new AI world, like what cybersecurity will look like. You can have performance, you can have analytics, you can have dashboards. Then you can sort of also do them. You do these horizontal products in sort of specific niches. For example, we have an investment in a company which is trying to create a foundational model just in robotics, a specialized foundational model that robots can use. Or, for example, people have done them for protein language models. They call PLM. So, in the biotech, people have created an LLM equivalent called PLM, right? People have done that for chemicals, in the chemicals industry. So you can also, with a large foundation models, small foundation models, you can create more infrastructure which is more specific to industries. You can also create layers on top of that, like I said, coding, testing, security, performance, reporting, all of this. These are all hard products to do, though, in my view. And the reason they're hard is they're expensive. You need a lot of compute. Monetization is hard. And especially with an India perspective, they're harder to do. That kind of capital is not as much not available here. You can find seed capital and all that, but I think, just the whole ecosystem is much more vibrant, let's say, outside of India, and all that. But having said that, there are sort of obviously more and more things happening. You can also do local versions of some of these foundation models. You can do India-centric versions, like obviously Kutrim came in, and similarly you can adopt different things which can localize and make sure they're more relevant for the market that you're in. Then on top of that, once you have all these horizontal layers and they're sort of falling into place, you have enough today. Then where's sort of the real, I think the juice is in what I would call is the enterprise adoption. So think of like how a bank or a healthcare industry or textile or manufacturing, can use this. There is kind of significant opportunity. There's sometimes called vertical AI. I think it's kind of a people use different terms, but basically we call it enterprise AI adoption. And there again, there is a whole set of opportunity. There's a consulting opportunity. So now Infosys and TCS of the world now have AI transformation teams, right, which are helping CIOs migrate to AI, right? Then actually think of it again, sort of you look at the SaaS software. So the SaaS has again been there now for at least 20 years or so. And I think I forget the number, but hundreds of billions of sort of revenue is being driven in SaaS today. I think one thesis is that literally all the SaaS will be recreated in the next 10, 15 years. So literally every company that you can think of, which is a SaaS company, will be either they will themselves kind of change a lot, or new disruptors will disrupt them. Realities both will happen. All of that will be created, using native AI kind of protocols. And I think so. We're seeing that happen, beginning to happen. We're seeing them in marketing, for example, how marketing campaigns are being created, to how you reach out to your customers, how lead generation is happening, how that is being tackled, things like that. We're seeing them in sales, so simple again, how from a sales call, we have a company called GTM Buddy, which kind of pretty much does the sales call, everything that you can, follow ups after sales, customer account management. Then you have things like hold the financial world, right, from accounts payable to accounts collection, even ledger entries. We have a company which works on SAP in one process, procure to pay process, and they made an AI agent just for procure to pay. So you look at the entire financial system, you can break it down in different ways, implement for that. Then of course you can go specific use cases, just like lane surf. You can, like, healthcare has so many use cases. If you think of like all the again, talking about the US, so much codification has happened over so many years, right? Like medical transcription is still happening out there, right? It's kind of obvious use case for AI, if there was ever an obvious use case, right? So I think there's just so many use cases that that one can really, depending on where one is coming from and what our experience is, you can start anywhere. I think things obviously that move quicker are the ones where always the business ROI is very clear. Like again, back to lane surf, why it has moved quickly, because the ROI is just very clear, from a customer perspective. Sometimes when your ROI is kind of embedded and comes in later, it's harder to take it to market. You have to sort of work harder at it. So I would say find opportunities where ROI is clearer, so that you can get going and solve the 0 to 1 problem quickly. Yeah.
Got it. Understood. While we were talking, we just got a question from Elias, who's in the audience. So I'll just quickly read out his question. So he's been a builder operator for the past 7 years at a company called Prism Force. So what Elias is asking is that, you're increasingly looking at independent individual contributors in startups build and ship features, products, etc., in a very, very short amount of time, right? But in a broader team environment, software development is not just about writing code. It's about collaboration, knowledge transfer, iteration, all of these things, right? So on one side, when you look at the generation of code, debugging, product feature enhancements, bug fixes, all being done by AI rather than people, how do you sort of, keep the human angle or the human element of software development still intrinsic to this? Right? How will teams ensure that their shared understanding, alignment across the development lifecycle is something that's still maintained, right? Because I mean, you could have written a piece of code, you may leave the organization, but look, you're doing a detailed knowledge transfer. So it's an interesting question. I wonder if your answer is also going to be that, look, this collaboration that's required today is not going to be required in the future, but just curious to understand how you think software development itself will change. So, and it's a little bit of a sidebar, but it's an interesting question. Thank you, Elias, for that.
So I was listening to, like, some of the sort of Bay Area speakers and NVIDIA CEO, and I think what they said was that your competition is not really, as a human, is not with AI as such. Your competition is with a different human who's doing more with AI than you are. So I think again, where we are in the genesis, there is definitely work for people. I don't think we are in a situation today, where machines can do everything, especially from a software development perspective. I see most software teams still growing, the traditional ones, though they're growing slower. And I think individual productivity going up, but also people are taking on more ambitious projects as well. So I think, like, if I again talk about biospace where we invest, there's so much more happening in biotech, which was just not earlier possible. So I think the scope of activity has become tenfold. So even if your productivity is, let's say, 5x, then you still need twice the number of engineers, to be able to pursue that. So I think right now we're still in that scope expansions phase, in my view, where there is a lot more to do. And I've always believed in human ingenuity, and maybe we'll go to Mars, maybe we'll do teleportation, maybe we'll do other things. So I think there is like a lot of problems, diseases, so many diseases we haven't conquered, so much poverty we haven't conquered. So there's lots for us to do, I think. And I think so we have to widen the scope of the problems. I think to your specific questions, I think humans, if I take a moral, so I don't see humans going away. I do think collaboration happens. I do think, people work in teams, they're more productive, they're getting a lot more done. But it's also true that with, systems available, you can query those systems in a much more friendly way. The need for similar level of documentation has reduced. And I think, so that does, the knowledge burden of it may have gone down, but the collaboration burden of it, I think, is still there. The human burden is still there. So being able to jive, being able to talk about ideas, problem solving, things like that, which I do think are things humans best do, and they continue to, in my view.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for that, Rajul. Maybe, picking off of the last thread that you were talking about before answering this question was about ROI, right? And I think one of the aspects that's linked very closely to ROI is GTM, right? Which is how do you sell? Now, as I've been looking at a lot of these software companies who are trying to build for traditional industries, obviously one of the core questions apart from technology and product is what are you actually selling? Right? Because it's not like the business that exists today is not functional, right? All these businesses are operating, they're all thriving, they're all doing well, whether it's a logistics company, whether it's hospital business, whether it's a bank or an NBFC, whatever it may be, right? And when you go ahead and you have to now convince the organization to pay you for an AI product or an AI solution that you want to deploy, my question always is, where is the money coming from? Are you replacing existing software solutions today? Probably very hard, right? Like no one's going to be replacing. I mean, at least I don't see it happening very easily that you would end up replacing something like SAP or Salesforce on day one, right? Maybe there's probably a journey to it, unless, of course, the companies themselves evolve in a more AI native manner and their products become friendlier, less monolithic, etc., etc. But that's one angle, right? Like it's a rip and replace. You have an existing budget, you're spending it on something. Hey, I have something that's much better according to a bunch of operational and functional metrics. You might as well give me the money. Right. The second is where the solution has to pay for itself, right? Like your example with LaneServe, you're able to do more with less. You're able to get better margins, better rates negotiated. You're creating value, which then you have a right to sort of apportion, right? And I found that this is not always very obvious or very simple or trivial because, as you said, right, sometimes the value propositions are embedded under layers. It's not very clear. So would love to understand, all of the companies that you're viewing, the ones that you decided to invest in, from a GTM perspective, from a value proposition communication to their ICP, to their buyer. How are some of the best companies going about it, right? How do you really sharpen that focus, cut through that clutter? Because there's hundreds of companies probably today trying to pitch to every enterprise saying, take my AI solution for fraud management, for calling, for this, for that, right? So I wanted to understand a little bit how should people think about value proposition? How should they think about and its linkage to GTM? Would love to understand that because that's honestly a problem that I'm also trying to wrap my head around as we evaluate software startups currently at Pickus as well.
So the capital usually finds its way to the highest momentum businesses, right? I think especially venture capital. Venture capital is very sort of क्या बोलते हैं, no qualms, no shame type of capital. So it's very sort of, it doesn't have any sort of moral dilemmas, things like that. It's typically, as an asset class, it follows the highest momentum companies or opportunities, that are there, which means the ones that grow faster are better. you know and I think, if you just by the same argument, the opportunities which are closer to demonstrating ROI very, very clearly are the ones which are getting the most venture capital. It's not that the next ones are not, then I think the ones which are a little bit more embedded also get it, but the next tier of capital, or maybe they have to try harder, they have to go longer, they have to demonstrate longer, right? Then I think the next one. And then there are the horizontals which have their own word. I think so far, if you look at sort of the capital that has gone on the last couple of years, a big portion of them have just gone in infrastructure, which is like foundational models and things like that. So I think the enterprise AI adoption capital is still only beginning to flow in, literally in the last year or so. and we are in very early stages of that. So again, it will follow the use cases, which is also linked to the GTM, which are very easily understood. And I think they are usually like lane serve, which are very, very sort of easy to understand for a layperson. They're not software sales. So if you look at SaaS, software as a service, this is really service as a software. It's kind of that's the term people are using. So SaaS has kind of change its meaning, flipped. So like CleanServe is not selling software; they're selling a service which is fully software enabled, right? Which is basically load booking service. So I think, but there are plenty of opportunities like that. Like we have at least 8, 9 companies like that. So for example, we have a company which does debt collection. Again, in the US, simple use case, you have credit card debt, which are, if it's a small amount of debt, less than $500, it's very expensive to collect once it goes past 30 days, 60 days, right? So most banks just write it off, or they would basically sell it to a collection agent for 20 cents to a dollar. So our company, we have a company called Finance Ops, which basically has an AI agent which collects this debt. Very simple, again, very ROI based. They only get paid once they collect, and get sort of a percent of the collections. So very easy for any buyer to try it out, and implement it. I gave you the SAP example, the procurement to pay. Again, sort of it's very predicated on the success of the procurement cycle. We see healthcare cases, we see sort of prop tech cases. We have a company which does, sort of it's a broker tool to make a first call whenever somebody posts a new property, because whoever makes the first call, usually gets the business. So I
Yep.
think it's just so these are very high ROI, high impact ROI cases. I think today we are in the part of the evolution where people are still finding enough of these, and getting after these, and they are the ones who are getting the most attention, and they are the easiest to sell also because the pitch is so easy, right? And I think there's a clear ROI, and hence some of these companies are seeing like hockey sticks, which have never been seen before. Like if you look at, I was hearing one of these Vicey guys, and Vicey in its entire history of last 15, 20 years had only one company which grew, consistently 10% month on month, or was it 20% month on month? There was only one company in entire history, which was, I think, Airbnb or something. And now I think the entire cohort on an average is going 20% month to month. So it's just like a totally different landscape, because the growth, because there's such a simple sale. Software sales is hard. It's like concept selling. You try something, ROI will come, da da da. It's still an automation pitch, right? But this is really literally a service pitch, right? It's a full business use pitch, which is very hard to ignore. The ROI is immediately there,
Yep.
and priced in. So I think if you're an entrepreneur today, I would say today, look for those kind of cases where you can do a full automation, deliver a full business value, and
Deliver an outcome as
outcome
you would say.
as an outcome, versus like a software. But it will change. We will be in a few years, there will be a situation where a lot of these will be done, and then we'll come to the next level of these and the next level of these. But today, I do think there's like enough opportunity.
Got it. Understood. No, I think that's super interesting because the way that I've also seen it is stuff like implementing SAP, etc., was necessary because your business simply could not scale without an ERP beyond a point, right? It was a growth limiter in some ways if your organization had to run using people heavy operations and spreadsheets and pen and paper, and it was not like consolidated, queryable, manageable from that perspective. But I think right now, as you said, the companies all run, right? They're not dying. Their base level capabilities to grow their businesses exist. So then it's about finding where you can allow them to either grow incrementally or faster, or to like reduce their losses and costs. And of course, it's impossible to ignore the entire context around software today because it's more outcome oriented as opposed to point solution oriented, that it can actually replace labor, right? So you're not just going after IT spend, you're actually going after the entire human capital spend that companies may potentially make. But of course, as you said, it's harder to do in certain spaces and easier to do in certain others. Maybe moving into the next part, which is sort of like understanding, right? Like we talked a little bit about, the whole service aspect, and going back to Global Logic, what people call forward deployed engineers in all these AI and SaaS companies today is essentially, in a very large extent, what all IT services have done for decades in some ways, if you think about it, right? But today you have software companies who are no longer just deploying software, but in many cases, they also need to send people to be able to drive that transformation, right? I think my friends in the US, they keep getting like insane amount of recruitment calls for forward deployed engineer roles. I think companies like Perplexity, OpenAI, etc. The number of people that they want to hire, Palantir obviously sort of pioneered the model in the SaaS era. People are like hiring absolutely like crazy. But at the same time, you're moving away, or not moving away, you're adding an operational and a people complexity beyond technology and product complexity, which SaaS has traditionally done. Your margin structures and cost structures consequently may look very different, right? So any sense on how you're seeing this evolve, right? What Global Logic to an extent is doing today in the space, what some of your portfolio companies are doing, just a broader sense of how this intermeshing of tech, product, and ops is going to happen, and how people need to think differently about scaling these businesses as opposed to scaling software sales businesses that
Right.
had been the mainstay over the last decade, 15 years or so.
Yeah, great point, Rohit. I think, look, when you're selling outcomes, then you do have to stitch together the entire outcome. And I think, you may have technology which does most of it, many times, but it still needs to be adopted. It needs to be integrated with internal systems, subsystems. Sometimes change management needs to happen. You can't transition suddenly, flip on a switch, so it's like a tapering down, tapering up, from one product to the other. So all these things which were earlier in our world called implementation engineers, implementation teams, system integration teams, now I think the modern word for them is forward engineers. And I think so we're definitely seeing that in our portfolio companies. I see Rex out for forward engineers, from our portfolio companies, which to me sound like the erstwhile system integrators, who are sort of understanding the customer systems, getting it implemented, have a little bit technical skill as well, stitch it together where it needs to be, a little bit problem solving, things like that. So that's definitely a new job role alongside prompt engineer, that has come up in the last year or two. So I think the extent, it's not clear to me if the sort of extent of it is going to be as massive as the SI became in erstwhile days. I think it's still early days. So we have to see how big it becomes. Like, but it should, at least in the near term, it should be a reasonable growth, according to me, because there's so many implementations happening.
Right.
I don't think the services companies, to my knowledge, have reoriented to
I
that
see.
today. Because it's all happening so quickly, and services have companies also work more with larger companies like SAPs, Oracles of the world, because they need a quanta of business. They can't really work with startups. The ticket size is just too small for it to move the needle for them. So I don't think service companies have warmed up to that opportunity
And
as of
if you
today.
look at the software companies themselves, the product
Mhm.
companies, the SaaS companies, how do you see them? I mean, obviously the role is very clear, as you said. It's only going to grow in the interim. To what extent we don't know.
Yeah.
But any advice for folks on how to think about building an FD function? How do you think about the ops and the people aspect of this? And that you're going to have to wear an operations hat even as a software and a product company, which maybe 5 years ago you didn't necessarily need to. You only wore a sales
Yeah.
hat along with the tech hat, but now you're going to have to add ops. So, any perspectives, any advice on how to maybe go about?
Yeah, it's a tough role. It's not like an R&D engineer's role. So I see some of the founders starting to do it themselves when they started, and then they kind of, because you do need to combine domain, business, customer, a little bit tech, a little bit problem solving and all that. So it's a high level role. It's kind of what you would call like the profile of people, or sort of like the product managers in the SaaS world, with some customer skills, are probably well placed to do these kind of things. But this is like I would say I see it growing to the extent of product managers, I would say. So
Interesting.
the way, if you see the number of product managers out there in the SaaS industry, we should have a similar number, if not more, of forward engineers. And it requires similar sort of cross-functional skills and things like that. So but I think, yeah, so I would look in those places as you build slightly more generalist with technical bent,
Got it.
when I look over these things.
Understood.
Yeah.
I have one question. It's a question which I have been grappling with as well. It's a hard question, so I may put you on the spot with it. But it's how do you think about defensibility of companies in the AI era, right? How should founders think about moats? Because if the ability to build if software, let's say not today, but in 3 years' time or 2 years' time, can essentially build itself, right? And the ability to build great products or build great software is no longer the moat, right? Then what are you selling to the customer at the end of the day? What is your right to continue selling? I've also heard the argument that, look, even SaaS was never about really building unique software. It was more about sales and implementation and workflows. And getting really, really deeply embedded in a way that people wouldn't want to let you go. But curious to hear your thoughts, especially how, what kind of competitive intensity your portfolio companies are facing. How are they able to win deals in a competitive market? And more importantly, sort of maintain them. I'm cognizant that it's not been a decade since this has happened. So we've not seen this cycle fully play out,
Yeah.
just from an early sense, right? How do you think about defensibility? How should founders think about moats when building AI software companies today?
So I'll answer this in two parts. When you think of defensibility, the first part of defensibility is your ability to win new business. So let's say you're pitching to a customer. Are there other competitors also pitching today the same product, and how do you win against that? So because we're in the early stages of this enterprise AI adoption, I think we are beginning to see some of this, but there's still lots of green spaces. So back to Lanes, for example, there is a much funded player in that company called Happy Robots, which Anderson has funded. So they're not the first, but Happy Robots is only 6 months ahead, and so it's not like they've captured the market. So most of the customers they're pitching to, nobody has pitched to them, and they have some uniquenesses, around within that industry, the kind of customers they're pitching to, so they're winning in that business. So I think today, in terms of sort of winning new business, I think it's still we have a lot of green spaces, in the next few years. Then there's the question of longer term defensibility, right? You imagine a world 2, 3 years down the line, 5 years down the line, where it's all settled down, a little bit, and then there is kind of a new player comes in, or you're taking away business from somebody else, or you're basically losing your business to a competitor and things like that. I don't think that has played out so far, because it's just too early in this evolution. In the first category, again, speed is considered to be a mode. So VCs love engineers today who are building even faster. So I think if you are somewhat like a medium speed engineer, it's very hard to fund you because the moat is viewed at this, that who's producing more features, who's sitting out the nights, producing even more features in the next 2 3 months versus your competitors. But in the longer term, I suspect the moat will come down to the things that you said, which is SaaS type moats, which are deep embedding with the customers, domain understanding, relationships, integration with subsystems, date proprietary data. I think, like, again, lane subs of the word, what they do is that, they claim that they have all these customers. The quality will always be better because they have the metadata, and all that. I don't know if it will sustain over a period of time, but, at least it's a legitimate theoretical claim to be made, So I think, these are going to be the modes which are not dissimilar to the SaaS modes.
I think that's super interesting also because, for example, if you want to transform traditional industries like manufacturing, like logistics, healthcare, whatever, right, where tech adoption is not or has not always been the top priority of management of the organization. It's probably second, third, or fourth on the priority list, right? If you're able to actually build fast and deploy fast, that's probably also because you know what to build better than others. So your subject matter understanding, domain expertise, knowing what features, what products to build, knowing how to articulate and position the value proposition is something that's super interesting. I also think there's this whole narrative over, do you build a very thick MVP product before you take it to a customer, or do you build a thin MVP product that gets the foot in the door but delivers value immediately? So essentially, what I'm taking away from what you're saying is that it's not just about the product engineering side of things. It's also a lot of this business thinking that becomes very, very important, because that's how you're able to optimize, right? Like you can take a year to build a product even today. You can take months to build a product today and
Yeah.
get in through the door. So I think vertical expertise and capabilities is probably going to be something that will be incredibly important going forward because the
And it was
horizontal is
always
easier
important
to
even in the
disrupt.
past. Even in the
Yeah.
past, it was important, right? I mean, you can't, SaaS products also can't just be built by R&D engineers, right? Product engineers. It needs to be, again, you need that domain knowledge. You need to be able to understand what to build and things like that. But I would say on a spectrum, yeah, maybe it's become even more important because as the sort of, let's say, engineering becomes a little bit easier, then these
Right.
things a little bit more gravitas.
Got it. Understood. No, super helpful. Just coming to the close of the conversation. changing gears a little bit from the companies building AI products to how companies can use AI to enhance their own businesses, right? But before I go into that, maybe have some questions from the audience. So one is a broader, more philosophical question again from Pranjal asking, what did you learn building these companies from scratch across different disciplines? There's literally no overlap between a payment processing company to a software development company to an educational business with Sunstone. Is there a sort of playbook, a framework that you follow, and some thoughts, on how you build this? I know it's a difficult question, but we'd love to get your 2 cents on what worked for you, and what are some of these core principles and concepts that you still hold dear, and mentor the founders who you work with today from your own experience.
Again, hard question to answer in a small time frame, but I would say, if you've read this book called Who Moved My Cheese, I think I've been a little bit like Sniff and Scurry, which is basically kind of really just following the smell of cheese more than anything else. I think look where the puck is going, be sufficiently agile, and sort of give it your best shot and keep moving. I think what has been my strategy, but I think there are plenty other strategies that have worked for other people as well.
And would you say then, Rajul, that your approach has been, I mean, I've known folks, for example, to take a playbook approach, right? Which is something that works, it's something that you refine over time, and you're able to repeatedly sort of implement it in different spaces, right? The context may change, but sort of that approach remains. The flip side, of course, is what you said, which is the who moved my cheese, which is more in terms of, say, first principles thinking, right? So, I do you see yourself more as someone who's first principles? Do you see yourself as someone who's more playbook oriented, or is it a combo of both of these things?
It's
It's
definitely,
an interesting
definitely,
question that
definitely
I want to
more,
ask.
definitely more first principles. And the simple reason is that I just think, at least in my view, the playbooks are very contextual. And I think it's a need to make these playbooks, and we sort of a lot of times make them in retrospect, but they don't always apply to the future because the contextual parameters completely change. So I think I'm definitely more in the sort of first principles and sniff and scurry category. Yeah.
Got it. Awesome. So maybe the last couple of questions for today before we wrap up. One, how are you seeing people implement AI to transform their own businesses? Right. I think it's obvious, using, say, Lovable or Cursor for code development and so on. But even in a broader sense, right, are you seeing companies implement it to, say, manage payroll? Are you seeing it from an HR and a recruitment perspective? Are you seeing it from a marketing perspective? Right. How can you leverage, right, and do more with less today as you build a business? And second, what advice would you have for the folks who are on the call and will be viewing this podcast later as they think about building companies in this time frame?
Yeah, I think firstly, I don't see companies, see the startups are still on the small side, and I mostly interact with startups and all that. And I don't think they're doing that much today with AI tools. I think everybody has started on that journey. So people are using vibe coding tools, like you said, to my extent. The other area where I see people experimenting a lot more is the GTM side. So again, because startups are so focused on revenue, right? That's what catches their attention usually quicker than anything else. So things which can run them better campaigns, things are sort of, email reach outs, email companions, lead qualifiers. I see people sort of using some of these tools, but it's still very early days. People are not, I haven't seen companies use them for internal systems at all so far, at least the startups. It will change, and I do think it's an opportunity for those of you who are building companies today to think of what like a truly native AI company would look like. I think there's talks these days of 1 billion, 1% billion-dollar companies, being possible in future. Sam Altman has said that multiple of times, and all that. So I do think more and more such things are possible today. You can be an ultra efficient company if you truly sort of use AI from the beginning. I don't see it enough today, to be honest, but I
Understood.
do think it's coming. I think this situation will change dramatically in the next 2 years. It's what I think.
Understood. And before we head out, any closing thoughts, anything that you'd want to, sort of tell the community in terms of how, they should think about going about things, and the advice that you have for founders, for operators. And I think, as Pranjal again has asked, it doesn't matter if you're not an engineer, but you're even a generalist in this space, right? Who's trying to build something. Any parting thoughts, any advice that you would have to offer?
Yeah, again, I was just listening to Sam Altman, and he said like he envies the kids who are graduating today at 21, 22 because they can do so much that was just not possible earlier on. So I think we're really in times of great opportunity, which is always a good thing. There's plenty of capital around, there's a lot of opportunity. But it really does come down to you finding, those opportunities, thrusting yourself into it. And the good thing is today, even engineers can both do a lot. Just given the tool set that we have, I think that sort of lines have blurred a little bit, versus earlier non-engineers, let's say, couldn't even get started, right? To do anything today, they can do that much more. They can create wireframes, they can create, in fact, 80% functional products in many cases, to get started. So I think we do have times of opportunity, but you have to wake up and smell the coffee. I do think there is a lot of, I don't see many people doing that still. I think many people are sort of still a little bit on the side, and yeah, have really not woken up fully to the opportunity.